Hey everybody, this is a chapter from Iring Fetscher's book, Marx and Marxism. The chapter is titled From the Philosophy of the Proletariat to the Proletarian Weltanschauung. I haven't decided exactly when. I think I'm going to break this one down into sections as well, because it's like it starts on page 148 and ends on page 182, so I'm probably going to break it down into sections. Yeah. So I'm going to probably read the introductory part first and have that be its own video, and then have each section as its own thing. Alright. So from the philosophy of the proletariat to proletarian Weltanschauung. This chapter is an attempt to show how Marxism changed during the process of the, quote, transcendence, end quote, of Hegelian philosophy into the conscious action of the proletariat. However, this transformation must not be considered as the, quote, responsibility, end quote, of individual thinkers, but must be understood on the basis of historical conditions and its necessity. The apologists of the Soviet ideology brand the playing off of the young Marx against the rigidified Marxism of our own time as a typical process of bourgeois mystification. Footnote. See, for example, the criticism by Karl Morff of Heinrich Popitz, Der entfremdete Mensch, in Deutsche Zeitschrift für Philosophie, Volume 3, quote, the discovery of the humanism of the early Marx ... has not by chance become one of the main objectives of a considerable number of Western interpreters of Marx. If the, quote, true Marx, end quote, is the Marx of the early writings, it automatically follows that the value of this later writing is reduced, and they are then revised in the light of his youthful period, which is still, quote, philosophical and anthropological, end quote, end quote. End footnote. It would in fact be untenable and ideal to derive any form of condemnation from the mere contrast between Marx's mature work and youthful conception. Yet Marx's early philosophical writings contain the key to an understanding of the entire political, economic, and political work, which can only be understood in its totality from this standpoint. Footnote. Siegfried Landhut, Introduction to Karl Marx, Die Frühschriften. Die Frühschriften. And there's a whole bunch of other things that's being listed here. Ludwig Landgraber, Hegel und Marx in Marxismus Studien, Tübingen, 1954, Jean Hippolyte de la structure du capital et de quelques, I don't know if I'm saying that right, présuppositions philosophiques de l'oeuvre de Marx, in Études sur Marx et Hegel. End footnote. However, while this basis and background to the work of Marx which constitutes its unity were being forgotten, Friedrich Engels developed in his Anti-Düring and other works the proletarian philosophy of, quote, dialectical materialism, end quote, in place of philosophy which would be, quote, aufgehoben, end quote, that is, sublimated or elevated, conserved, and overcome at the same time by the conscious action of the proletariat, there arose a, quote, science, end quote, which was made into a Weltanschauung with the help of dialectics. This was not, however, done by chance, but precisely to the extent to which the immediate expectation of salvation from revolutionary socialism appeared itself as self-deception. The revolution failed to materialize, and the capitalism which was already pronounced dead in reality experienced a fresh upsurge. Footnote. Karl Korsch, Marxismus und Philosophie. Quote, the specific position which is decisive only for the history of, quote, Marxism and philosophy, end quote, is the delimitation of the second of these periods of development, which is not sufficiently differentiated from the others in other respects, and which I consider to have begun with the June Battle of 1848 and the subsequent age of an enormous growth of capitalism and the simultaneous elimination of all the organizations which had already arisen in the previous historical epoch, and of the dreams of the working class for emancipation in the 1850s, and which finally terminates at about the turn of the century, ... end quote. End footnote. Marx's original central thought was now religiously glorified into an, quote, ultimate aim, end quote, and the main accent of his contribution shifted to a demonstration of the self-destruction of bourgeois capitalist society, which takes place, quote, with natural necessity, end quote. Quote, with natural necessity, end quote. Collective and conscious proletarian action was first replaced by the organization of the proletariat within the existing bourgeois order of society. Organizational unity, however, had to be guaranteed and secured by means of a common Weltanschauung. The proletariat, which grew culturally into petite bourgeois national surroundings, had to be distinguished ideologically from its milieu. Defense against the growing influence of a non-Marxist Weltanschauung was the reason for Engels' major philosophical work, his Anti-Iring. The dialectical materialist philosophy propagated by Engels can be described as a subtilization of the vulgar materialist monist concept, which was generally current at the time. Individual features of dialectics, understood as universal theory of movement, were used for an interpretation of nature, and a dialectics which was held to be uniformly valid for nature and history. Nature and history was viewed as evidence for the correctness of historical materialism. Engels, and after him Lenin, and his followers attempted to use the prestige of the natural sciences to support the esteem in which the Marxist doctrines were held. The belief in the sovereignty of the natural science was transferred to the Marxist science of economics and society, while Marx wished to, quote, transcend, end quote, philosophy concretely. In the dialectical sense, in the conscious historical action of the proletariat, it was now replaced, according to the trends of the age, by an allegedly, quote, scientific Weltanschauung, end quote. Footnote. See Friedrich Engels' Anti-Iring. Quote, as soon as each individual science is required to clarify its position in the general context of and knowledge of things, any special science of this totality is superfluous. All that then independently survives the previous philosophy is the theory of thought and thought's laws, formal logic and dialectics. Everything else is integrated in the positive science of nature and history. End quote. Friedrich Engels. The interpretation of consciousness in action was broken, and the organized proletariat moved to one side, its, quote, scientific Weltanschauung to the other. This reification and alienation of consciousness in a philosophical form only mirrored in sociological terms the discipline of the organization and the appearance of an authoritarian hierarchy of leadership. Every strengthening of this order necessarily led to a hardening of the ideology, while, on the other hand, with a large measure of democracy within the party, the outlines of uniform philosophy became blurred and expression was given to historico-cultural differences within the proletariat. It was not by chance that the, quote, proletarian Weltanschauung, end quote, of dialectical materialism became particularly ossified at the very point where a large and strong proletariat was not yet present, in particular after the period of a real revolution from below was over. Together with the construction and congealing of the hierarchical party organization, Engels' doctrines were developed, and again not by chance displayed all the features of scholasticism. The conservation of the theories propounded by Engels in the 1870s and 1880s led, contrary to the original intention, to a growing mental philistinism of the proletariat, which artificially retained the petite bourgeois attitudes of the last century. Engels equated Darwin's theory of evolution and Marx's historical materialism. See Friedrich Engels' speech at the graveside of Karl Marx, quote, just as Darwin discovered the laws of evolution in organic nature, so Marx discovered the law of development of human history, end quote. Friedrich Engels. The fundamental difference existing between a realization of causal relationships outside of mankind and a self-realization capable of transforming proletarian humanity was therefore eliminated. A theory which sought to realize its aims through a growing consciousness of the proletariat which could lead to action developed into a Weltanschauung which the proletariat was expected to, quote, subscribe to, end quote. Though incorporation into the comprehensive structure of dialectical materialism, the historical materialism of Marx was also changed in qualitative terms and became a component of this, quote, reified ideology, end quote. Revolutionary Weltanschauung was present side by side with political practice and generally conflicted with the latter. Karl Kautsky was considered the chief ideologist of the Marxist labor movement and recognized until 1914 even by Lenin, and was able at the same time to act in a perfectly reformist way in the daily political struggle. Footnote. See the contribution of Erich Matthias in Marxism Studien 2. End footnote. Dialectical and historical materialism was perhaps an organizational requirement of German social democracy, but it was not a necessary prerequisite for a policy which was determined by pragmatic standards and democratic traditions. Lenin and Stalin could, of course, not be prevented from adopting a radically different policy on the basis of the same philosophy, corresponding to their own appraisal of the requirements of the situation in Russia. If the ideology of Kautsky and his followers served to pacify the revolutionary conscience, it became a justification for various political actions in the case of Lenin and still more so for Stalin. In both cases, its factual function scarcely corresponded to the alleged role of providing a scientific basis for political decision. Lenin differed from Kautsky and Kautsky's followers less through Lenin's dialectical materialistic philosophy than through Lenin's keen political insight, Lenin's genius for leadership, and Lenin's active will to bring about revolutionary progress. It was only in the early 1920s that a number of thinkers began to renew the thought of Marx. The genius of Georg Lukács's history and class consciousness lies above all in the fact that Lukács came astonishingly close to the theory developed by Marx in the key work of his youth, Political Economy and Philosophy, which Lukács could not have been acquainted with. Footnote. Georg Lukács' History and Class Consciousness, 1923. Critiques from the position of Soviet Marxism, Abram Deborin, Lukács und seine Kritik des Marxismus in Arbeiterliteratur, and Zinoviev in Internationale Pressekorrespondenz, Volume 4. Criticism of Lukács from the social democratic standpoint are... Criticisms of Lukács from the democratic standpoint are... Karl Kautsky in Die Gesellschaft, Volume 1, June 1924, and Siegfried Mark in Neue Kritische, Neue Hegelsche Auffassung der Dialektik in die Gesellschaft, Volume 1. Mark plays off the neo-Kantian standpoint of Max Adler and Alb Carnot against Lukács' uncritical Hegelianism. This dispute becomes even wider in the context of his book, Die Dialektik im Denken der Gegenwart, Volume 1. In the context of the present discussion of Lukács' youthful work, see also Maurice Merleau-Ponty's Les Aventures de la Dialectique of 1955 and the orthodox communist criticism of this book, Gardi, Cagnoy et al., Mes Aventures de l'Antimarxisme, Les Malheurs de Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Paris, 1956. This work also contains a letter from Lukács in which he specifically rejects his early work. Quote, I was still in the process of transition from Hegel to Marxism, and what is more, to a Marxism which at the time was wholly sectarian and marked by the influence of Rosa Luxemburg. My standpoint then included an incorrect resolution of the most important problems of dialectics, in the partial rejection of the theory of reflection and the rejection of dialectics with nature, and so on. Hence, this book is a typical product of a transition with all its inner contradictions, eclecticism, and confusion, end quote, Lukács. A disciple of Lukács, Lucien Goldman, writes, quote, Lukács has now departed from this excessive degree of idealism, which he himself terms, quote, apocalyptic, end quote, Lucien Goldman, 1952. See also Georg Lukács' autobiographical description of his, quote, Road to Marx, end quote, published in 1933, reprinted for in the 60th birthday Festschrift. End footnote. New footnote. The Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, first published in Mega Part 1, Volume 3 in Berlin in 1932, zur Kritik der Nationalökonomie mit einem Schlusskapital über die Hegelsche Philosophie, simultaneously published in Landshut Meyer, Karl Marx, der historische Materialismus, 1932, individual edition by Erich Thier, Nationalökonomie und Philosophie, Cologne, 1950. Recently also, with the exception of the section titled Critique of Hegelian Dialectics and Philosophy in General, which is contained in Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels' Die Heilige Familie und Unterer Philos. These are like abbreviations. Frühschriften in Berlin, 1953, and Marx Engels' Kleine Ökonomische Schriften, Berlin, 1955. The latter contains the mega text with a range of improvements and is therefore the most reliable available at present. End footnote. Lukács's grounding in the bourgeois renewal of interest in Hegel naturally also contributed to this closeness to the young Marx. The above-mentioned relationship between Kautsky and Lenin was clear in the reaction to the second important work of the Marx Renaissance, Karl Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy, which was violently criticized, like Lukács's books, by the Soviet ideologists and even by Kautsky himself. Footnote. See the critical introduction by the author of the Russian edition of the first edition of Marxism and Philosophy, G.R. Bammel, Moscow, 1924, and the review, which is identical in all major points, by Karl Kautsky in Die Gesellschaft, Volume 1, June 3rd, 1924. End footnote. The return from Come on. The comprehensive materialistic Weltanschauung to the theory of consciously acting proletariat was no longer possible within the official parties. It was impossible in the Soviet Union because there a state capitalist dictatorship over a country of peasants masqueraded as a dictatorship of the proletariat, so that no genuine movement of the proletariat, which in reality represented a small minority of the population, was possible on a broad and free basis. Footnote. See the important book by the former communist Arthur Rosenberg, Geschichte des Bolschewismus von Marx bis zur Gegenwart, of 1932. Rosenberg's main theory is that the Soviet Union is not a socialist proletarian state, but a state capitalist dictatorship of the party leadership, and that the Communist Party in the USSR cannot in this capacity exercise effective leadership over the world revolutionary movement. The national state and state capitalist interests of the Soviet Union do not coincide with those of the communist parties of foreign proletariats. Quote, indirectly the existence of the non-proletarian peasant masses justifies the party and apparatus dictatorship over Soviet Russia, end quote. Quote, the complete intellectual freedom which belongs to a genuine socialist society is admittedly not present in the Soviet Union because the dominant party dictatorship cannot live without a dogmatically rigid doctrine which is binding on all concerned, namely, quote, Leninism. I think Arthur Rosenberg was a Trotskyist. But end footnote. Where the hell am I? It was never impossible in the West, because there the proletariat, which could never represent an absolute majority of the population, underwent a development from the revolutionary to the reformist position. The philosophical superiority of these thinkers was in inverse relationship to their political effectiveness, and the ideologization and simplification of Marxism seemed to be an inevitable fate. If Engels, following the need of the German proletariat for education, developed a comprehensive philosophy, Lenin saw the latter exclusively from the standpoint of its usefulness. The objective was the uniform alignment of the Russian and, if possible, also the non-Russian workers' movement, the belief in the possible victory and effectiveness of the revolutionary action of the party, certainty of the superiority of their own, quote, scientific Weltanschauung, end quote, over all competing ideologies, and the absolute belief in the authoritarian leading group which ruled on this basis. The historical development therefore led to a reproduction of an ideological consciousness on a new (higher?) level. While bourgeois historical ideology asserted the dominance of general ideas, but in reality reified structural relationships independent of man's will had become a power opposing them, the proletarian historical ideology consists in asserting the rational rule of the proletarian class interest expressed in dialectical materialism and supposedly coinciding with the interest of mankind, while in reality a small ruling clique manipulates and interprets both this interest and its ideological expression in a sovereign way. This study takes as its point of departure Marx's critique of the bourgeois consciousness as ideological, then develops the core of the philosophy of the self-conscious proletariat, in which Marx overcame the contrast between idealism and materialism, and goes on to indicate the significance of this thought for the life work of Marx. In a second section, the construction of a proletarian Weltanschauung of dialectical materialism by Engels is examined, and in a third, the continuation of the latter by Lenin. My aim is to show the radical break between the philosophical revolutionary intention of Marx and the ideological reactionary intention of the Soviet, quote, scientist, end quote. It would be quite wrong to see a complete loss of continuity in this break. Naturally, the present-day Soviet ideology still contains elements of Marxist philosophy, but the present-day Soviet ideology the elements of Marxist philosophy are, as it were, stretched on the Procrustean bed of pseudo-dialectical dogma and robbed of their revolutionary bite. The real requirements of the concrete historical situation, such as that of the Soviet-Russian leadership stratum, can, however, in no way be dismissed as mere chance on the basis of Marxist conviction, or criticized as distortions of an originally pure truth. I shall simply observe the facts and apply the Marxist notion of, quote, reification, end quote, to an ideology which claims for itself the title of a, quote, scientific Weltanschauung, end quote.